Frost still clung to the fence posts when the Prairie Trust Bank truck rolled up her driveway. Standing near her grain bins, coffee going cold in her hand, she watched two representatives staple a seizure notice to her gate, the same gate her great-grandfather had installed when he first broke the Saskatchewan prairie sod in 1919. Yes, this really happened. The bank really did seize her 1,900 acres. She really did warn them, formally, that something was wrong with their claim. And in that Saskatchewan courtroom, the judge really did go completely silent, for reasons nobody in that room expected. Comment below, and tell me where you're watching this from. Colleen Braithwaite had farmed this stretch of Saskatchewan grain country for 26 years, taking over from her father after he retired from the operation his own father had started nearly a century earlier. Wheat, canola, and lentils rotated across those 1,900 acres every season, the rhythm unchanged since her great-grandfather first registered the land under the province's title system in the years following the First World War. She'd survived drought years, grasshopper plagues, and two brutal commodity price crashes that had pushed neighboring operations into bankruptcy. This dispute with Prairie Trust Bank, she said later, felt different from the moment it started. It began with a letter citing a boundary discrepancy tied to her operating loan's collateral description. The bank claimed a recent land titles registry update had revealed that 300 of her 1,900 acres, a parcel along her western boundary, had never been properly transferred into her name during a subdivision decades earlier, meaning her loan's collateral was insufficient and technically in violation of her lending agreement. Colleen was stunned. Her family had farmed every inch of that western parcel her entire life, paid property taxes on it without interruption, and held what she believed was a clean, fully registered title. Calling the bank's regional office got her nowhere useful. A representative explained that the Saskatchewan Land Titles Registry had undergone a modernization project 2 years earlier, migrating decades of paper records into an electronic system, and that the migration had apparently failed to carry over a specific transfer document tied to her parcel. Without that document appearing in the new digital system, the bank considered her collateral incomplete and was proceeding with partial seizure of the disputed acreage to cover the shortfall. Refusing to accept this quietly, Colleen drove to the provincial land titles office with her own paper deed in hand, a physical document her father had kept in a safety deposit box for decades, showing the parcel's transfer, clearly recorded and stamped in 1987. The clerk at the registry office looked at the paper deed, then at her computer screen, and admitted the digital record simply didn't match what Colleen was holding. But without a corresponding digital entry, the clerk explained, the paper deed alone couldn't override what the modernized system now showed as the official record. That night, sitting at her kitchen table, Colleen spread out every land document her family had kept across 4 generations. The gap she found was 30 years wide. Cross-referencing survey maps, old tax assessments, and correspondence going back decades, she found something that made her sit back in her chair. A formal notice, sent to every landowner during the registry's digital migration project, informing them of a 90-day window to flag any discrepancies before the digital records became legally authoritative. Her family had never received that notice, and the mailing address the registry claimed to have used didn't match any address her family had lived at in over 30 years. Determined to get someone to take her seriously, Colleen filed a formal written dispute with the Provincial Land Titles Registry, laying out the mailing address discrepancy in careful detail and attaching copies of her original 1987 deed alongside every tax document proving continuous ownership. Saskatchewan's land titles legislation required proper notification before any digital migration could override an existing paper record, and she wanted a clear paper trail proving the registry had failed that requirement in her specific case. The response, when it finally arrived 2 months later, was brief and unhelpful. The registry confirmed the notice had technically been sent, according to their internal mailing logs, and considered the matter closed on their end. Prairie Trust Bank, meanwhile, informed her the seizure proceedings on the disputed 300 acres would continue as scheduled, with a court date set for early spring. Before we get to what happened when this reached a courtroom, hit subscribe, because the discovery that silenced a Saskatchewan judge started with a mailing address nobody at the registry wanted to explain. With the court date now approaching, Colleen found a rural property lawyer in Regina who'd handled land titles disputes tied to the modernization project before, a niche but apparently growing area of litigation across the province. The lawyer, reviewing her documentation, confirmed what Colleen already suspected. If the registry genuinely failed to properly notify her family during the migration's mandatory dispute window, the resulting digital record could be challenged as legally deficient, regardless of what the current system displayed. Filing a formal request for the registry's internal mailing records triggered a discovery process, forcing both the registry and Prairie Trust Bank to produce documentation neither party seemed eager to hand over quickly. The registry's legal representatives requested repeated extensions, citing the volume of historical mailing records tied to a province-wide project spanning tens of thousands of properties. Such resistance struck Colleen's lawyer as unusual for what should have been a simple record search. When the mailing logs finally arrived, just days before the scheduled hearing, he spent an entire weekend cross-referencing the claimed notification address against decades of tax records, utility bills, and municipal correspondence tied to the Braithwaite family. Every single document from the past 30 years listed the same rural route address. The migration notice, according to the registry's own internal log, had been mailed to an address in a different municipality entirely, one that, as far as either of them could determine, had no connection to the Braithwaite family whatsoever. The Saskatchewan courtroom filled with more spectators than usual that morning. Word having spread locally that Colleen's case had grown into something larger than a simple boundary dispute. Prairie Trust Bank sent 2 lawyers and a land titles registry representative, all appearing confident this would be resolved quickly in the registry's favor given how routine digital migration disputes had become across the province. Colleen's lawyer opened by walking the judge through the mailing address discrepancy, laying the registry's own internal log beside 30 years of tax records and utility statements, all consistently listing the Braithwaite family's actual rural route address. The bank's lawyer dismissed it initially as a minor administrative error, arguing the digital record now stood as the legally authoritative version regardless of any notification mishap. Then Colleen's lawyer introduced what he'd found while tracing the incorrect mailing address itself. He explained that the address the registry claimed to have used for the migration notice wasn't simply wrong. It matched, almost exactly, the address of a numbered company that had purchased a large block of neighboring farmland during the same period. A company whose ownership records, once traced through provincial corporate filings, led back to a former land titles employee who had left the registry's employment shortly after the digital migration project concluded. Called to explain the connection, the registry representative initially insisted this had to be coincidental, that thousands of addresses had been processed during the migration, and errors were statistically inevitable at that scale. Colleen's lawyer then produced internal registry emails, obtained through discovery, showing that same former employee had personally handled the batch of records that included the Braithwaite property, and had flagged several properties in that batch for boundary reassessment shortly before departing the registry. Saying very little throughout the morning, the judge finally asked the registry representative directly whether any investigation had ever been conducted into that former employee's handling of flagged properties after his departure. She hesitated, admitted she wasn't aware of one, and acknowledged the registry had no record of following up on any of the properties he'd flagged before leaving. Slowly setting the documents down, the judge sat in silence for nearly a full minute, reviewing the timeline once more. A misdirected notice, a departed employee with a suspicious pattern of flagged properties, and a family who'd farmed and paid taxes on that land continuously for decades without interruption. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured but unmistakably pointed. This was no longer simply a case about Colleen Braithwaite's 300 acres. It was a case that potentially called into question the integrity of an entire province-wide digital migration project. Ruling decisively that afternoon, the judge restored the disputed 300 acres to Colleen's title in full, and ordered Prairie Trust Bank to immediately withdraw the seizure proceedings against her land. But the ruling reached considerably further than her individual case. He ordered the Provincial Land Titles Registry to conduct a full audit of every property the former employee had flagged for boundary reassessment before his departure, and referred the matter to provincial authorities for further investigation into whether those flags had been used to improperly redirect ownership disputes toward outside parties. 11 other Saskatchewan farm families turned out to have been affected by the same former employee. The investigation that followed revealed several of whom had already lost portions of their land through seizure proceedings similar to Colleen's before anyone connected the pattern. Provincial land titles officials issued a public statement acknowledging serious irregularities tied to the digital migration project and committed to reviewing every flagged property under the same scrutiny applied to Colleen's case. Local agricultural advocacy groups began citing Colleen's case in discussions with provincial lawmakers about strengthening oversight during large-scale land registry digitization efforts, particularly around requiring independent verification whenever ownership records changed during migration. Her name began appearing in provincial farm publications, not as a cautionary tale, but as the reason a much larger irregularity had finally come to light. Colleen herself returned to her fields that spring largely unchanged by the attention, planting canola on the same 300 acres her great-grandfather had first broken over a century earlier. She kept her father's original paper deed in a new safety deposit box, alongside copies of every document from the case, a habit she said she'd never abandon, regardless of how digital the province's records became. What stayed with people who followed her case wasn't just the legal victory, though it mattered plenty to the 11 other families whose land was now under review because of it. It was the reminder that a single misdirected letter, buried inside a massive digital migration project nobody outside the registry ever fully scrutinized, had nearly cost a family land 4 generations had worked, and that it took one farmer's refusal to accept the digital record is now authoritative as the final word before anyone caught it. Her land is hers again, planted and growing exactly as it always had. And somewhere in a provincial registry office, 11 other farm files are being reviewed today because Colleen Braithwaite kept her father's paper deed instead of trusting a system to remember what her family already knew. A misdirected notice, buried inside a provincial digital migration project, nearly cost 11 Saskatchewan families their land until one farmer's paper deed exposed it. Her stubbornness saved far more than her own 300 acres. If this story moved you, subscribe for more real stories of ordinary people who refuse to back down.